But if you could maybe...
Hello, everyone.
Then I'll endorse it.
My name is Martin Drake. I'm a 3L here at the law school. I'm also president of the Harvard Law Forum, one of the sponsors of this conference. Welcome, and thanks for coming all the way down to the basement for our panel on economic democracy through monetary design. So this conference, in recognizing money as a public project, I think necessarily leads to a re-examination of the types of economic institutions that are promoted by our monetary system. It was highlighted in, actually, earlier today, I think it was the first or second panel, where someone asked a question that's really pertinent to our panel today, or now. How can you construct a democratic monetary system when the way most people get their money is through the very undemocratic employment contract? And throughout American history, both social movements and the US government have seen the potential to create, through the monetary system, an economy that has more democratic forms of economic organization. This panel, its goal is to examine both the historical and modern attempts to create more widespread and democratic ownership of the productive economy through the monetary system. Through our four panelists, we're hoping to answer two fundamental questions, or at least focus our discussion around them. One is, what role does the monetary system play in shaping the hierarchical structure of our economic institutions? And two, what monetary reforms, if any, can encourage or create an economy where more participants have access to both economic and decision-making power? So, on the logistics of the panel, our four panelists are each going to present for 15 minutes. Since we're time constrained, I'll have a timer that'll keep us in check. And then we'll use any remaining time for questions. Now, to introduce our panel, first we'll hear from University of Illinois' Professor Jeffrey Sklansky, who will start our panel with a dive into the specifics of the monetary proposals of the 1890s populist movement, which attempted to support their large-scale cooperative farming institutions through monetary creation at the level of agricultural production. Next, we'll move on to two speakers that address worker participation in corporate governance. First, we'll hear from Cornell Law School Professor Robert Hockett, who does not have a name card.
They said I was from Tulane. I didn't want to offend my colleagues. But
yeah, it would have been a strange way to announce the departure from Cornell.
I love there would be, right? I grew up in New Orleans. I love Tulane, but I don't want to insult Cornell. So anyway.
Might I suggest the Rockstar drink? Is all the tag that you need.
Yeah.
Rockstar.
And then we will also hear from Lenore Palladino, who's the senior economist and policy counsel at the Roosevelt Institute. Her work argues that corporate governance must be expanded to more stakeholders in order to foster a more accountable form of capitalism. Rounding out the panel is Rutgers University Professor Joseph Blasi. Professor Blasi is the director of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Quite the long title of that institute. Professor Blasi will comment on the wide-ranging history of policy on broad-based capital shares in the United States, along with some more modern examples and policy ideas, and will situate the other presentations in a sort of broader context of economic democracy and American history. So that's it. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Professor Jeffrey Sklansky, and you're welcome to stay at the table or come up here, whatever you like.
Hi, good evening. I'm really excited to be at this conference, and I want to thank Martin Drake for organizing this panel and inviting me to take part. My paper is drawn from my recent book, which is called Sovereign of the Market, which is an intellectual history of the long struggle over alternative modes of producing money in 18th and 19th century America. The book focuses on three main phases in the career of what Americans call the money question. First, colonial conflicts over the innovation of paper currency directly issued by elected legislatures. Second, Jacksonian battles over the rise of thousands of state-chartered commercial banks, each issuing its own banknotes, which made up much of the new nation's money supply. And finally, late 19th century struggles over the establishment of a national banking system, a national paper currency, and the international gold standard. I'm presenting here something from that third phase. It's an abbreviated version of a chapter on the preeminent economic theorist of the populist movement, Charles McCune, and his path-breaking efforts to devise a system of currency and credit that would support the cooperative enterprise of cash-poor but commodity-rich grain growers and cotton cultivators in the Gilded Age. My argument is basically that the radical monetary reform that became the central cause of the last great agrarian uprising in American history, that is McCune's Subtreasury Plan, arose from commercial farmers' confrontation with the pervasive problem of association. It emerged, that is, from their struggle to comprehend and control mass production and mass distribution on an unprecedented scale, and from their identification of money as what the political economist Henry Carey called the great instrument of association, the material means of a new kind of industrial democracy in which the growth of market relations might knit people together in increasing harmony and mutuality instead of class strife. In the book, I follow McCune's intellectual migration through a series of pivotal shifts in his views in the face of repeated frustrations and failures, culminating in his embrace of financial reform as the key to the farmer's cause. Due to time constraints, I'll just mention briefly the earlier stages of his development in order to focus, as he came to do, on the social meaning of money. McCune began his career in the early 1870s as an ardent advocate of the New South amalgam of white supremacy and business boosterism as the means of liberating the upcountry yeomanry from its previous subservience to the plantation economy. But his observations of the rise of the crop lien system suggested to McCune that the racial divide served to bolster an emerging structure of debt peonage that bound white smallholders and tenants and black sharecroppers alike. At the same time, the failure of the New South to uplift backcountry settlers led him to disavow his earlier faith in industrial development and to call for farmers to unite across race and region to control the prices of their crops and supplies. As leader of the Southern Farmers Alliance, McCune advanced an ambitious two-track agenda of expansion and cooperation, successfully forming the largest agrarian organization in American history prior to the 20th century, and directing a large-scale cooperative business that purchased supplies and marketed crops for farmers all across Texas, which provided a model for the spread of similar cooperatives throughout farming country. Aside from its unprecedented scale, the major innovation of the Farmers Exchange, the Texas Farmers Exchange, was McCune's plan for more prosperous farmers collectively to extend credit to their poorer neighbors. But as the exchange and scores of other cooperatives failed across the country for reasons that I won't detail here, McCune concluded that the root causes of farmers' condition lay not in the market for supplies or crops themselves, but in the structure and supply of the money with which they were bought and sold. Cooperation required a different currency. In the late 1880s and 1890s, McCune came to articulate an original explanation of the causes of agricultural depression. Previous currency critics in the 19th century had treated the demand for money as rising steadily from year to year in step with the growth of the market economy. What was needed by this logic was a mechanism for similarly increasing the money supply at the rate of economic growth so that it wouldn't become an increasingly scarce asset. By maintaining a stable ratio between monetary supply and demand, the argument went, prices could be kept constant as well, or rather they could be allowed to rise and fall in relation to the supply and demand for particular commodities without being distorted by inflation or depression in the economy as a whole. What others had missed, according to McCune, was that the demand for money did not increase uniformly with the total volume of transactions for which it was called into use. In reality, monetary demand varied qualitatively from one economic sector to another, and it fluctuated steeply over the course of each year, particularly for farmers. He argued that previous writers' neglect of the sectoral and cyclical variability of monetary demand comported reasonably well with the conditions for manufacturing, which produced a relatively unvarying output of goods throughout the year and therefore required a stable supply of money to keep prices from fluctuating overall. The demand for money in the agricultural sector, however, was far more volatile. Commercial growers, particularly those who cultivated durable staples such as wheat and cotton, marketed the great majority of their annual produce all at once in the few months following the harvest. As McCune explained, this seasonal onslaught of selling had become more marked than ever in the late 19th century, partly due to the development of the railroad and the telegraph, and partly due to the pressures of the crop lien system, under which farmers were compelled to put their entire crop up for sale as soon as it was harvested in order to meet the demands of their creditors. Since the supply of money varied little from season to season, McCune continued, the surge in agricultural demand for the means of exchange in the late summer and fall created a severe scarcity of money just when farmers were selling, dramatically depressing the prices of cash crops. The subsequent fall in monetary demand led to a great glut of money in the winter and spring, sharply inflating the prices of farmers' supplies. Anticipating 20th century theorists of concurrent currencies and multiple monies, McCune therefore urged the dual creation of a stable money supply sufficient to meet the demands of the manufacturing sector, supplemented by an elastic supply tied to the seasonal cycle of the agricultural sector. At the same time, McCune crucially argued that the privately controlled creation of currency by banks should be abolished, so that government would reclaim its rightful exclusive authority over the means of exchange. What was needed, he contended, was, quote, a government issue, the volume of which shall be increased to correspond with the actual addition to the wealth of the nation presented by agriculture at harvest time, and diminished as such agricultural products are consumed. Such an elastic currency was the main economic goal of the so-called Subtreasury Plan, devised by a special committee on the monetary system appointed by the National Farmers Alliance and led by McCune. The plan called for replacing the national banking system established during the Civil War with a federal system of sub-treasuries, which would operate public warehouses where farmers could store their staple crops, receiving in turn a new kind of legal tender paper currency equal to a maximum of 80% of the value of the products deposited, for which the farmers would be charged a nominal 1% interest annually. These sub-treasury notes would circulate freely as cash, and the farmers could use them to pay for their supplies. Though the plan was never enacted, it became for several years the centerpiece of the agrarian cause, and the arguments made on its behalf reveal the breadth of McCune's vision of monetary and financial reform. The most basic features of the Subtreasury Plan, as McCune conceived it, concerned its provisions for the marketing of farmers' staples. It provided for the government to construct and maintain storage facilities in 1,000 counties across the South and West, allowing farmers to store their goods locally instead of in the cities, and without paying exorbitant rates to the owners of warehouses or elevators. Most importantly, it would allow farmers to turn their crops into cash up to 80% of their value without having to sell them as soon as they were harvested, alleviating the intense downward pressure on prices that came from the rush of sales each fall. The low-interest loans they received in the form of sub-treasury notes would enable farmers to buy their supplies in cash, freeing them from the grip of furnishing merchants, country storekeepers, charging exorbitant prices for buying on credit. In this way, the Subtreasury Plan would also eliminate the power and incentive for merchants and financiers to hoard money, encouraging them to invest it, he thought, productively instead. McCune called his market ideal equivalence of service, meaning that commodities, as he said, should exchange for other commodities of equivalent value determined by the labor or service required for their production. Commodities exchanging directly for commodities, producers trading directly with consumers, though on a mass scale. This was a vision in which the mechanisms of finance and exchange no longer charged a toll or distorted commodity markets, as he saw it. The spirit of his ideal came close to what McCune called the scientific anarchy of the French radical Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose ideas he professed to admire. In his Solution of the Social Problem, 1849, Proudhon articulated what he called his principle of reciprocity, which he said was essentially the golden rule applied to market relations. In his words, products exchange for products. What must we do to make possible direct exchange, not only among 3, 4, 6, 10, or 100 traders, but among 100,000, between all producers and all consumers, Proudhon asked, explaining his goal of, quote, disintermediation. His answer was that what was required was not to eliminate money, but to make everything money, in a sense. Let all merchandise become current money, in his words, and abolish the royalty of gold. Gold was the ultimate despot in modern market society, according to Proudhon. His goal was to overthrow its despotic power by monetizing, in effect, all commodities. Quote, if all the products of labor had the same exchange value as money, all the workers would enjoy the same advantages as the holders of money. Everyone would have in his ability to produce an inexhaustible source of wealth, unquote. The Midas-like power to make everything money, to make all merchandise as good as gold, he imagined, would be tantamount to dethroning money as a power unto itself. McCune shared Proudhon's animus toward what he similarly referred to as the tyranny of gold, which he regarded as a vestige of the original basis of commercial oppression in the ancient world, namely merchants' exclusive control over the precious metals. As it did for many agrarian radicals at the time, the gold standard stood, in his eyes, for the age-old practice of conferring special privilege on the precious assets of moneyed men over against the values created by the producing classes. Yet, unlike partisans of free silver, McCune did not simply seek to make the money standard broader. He aimed to make it more truly universal, as he saw it, by conferring the status of money on the leading commodities of the country, making cotton as good as the white gold with which it was often equated. As the Subtreasury Plan became the target of vociferous attack, McCune frequently said that the details of the plan were far less important than the principles it embodied, both as a critique of the existing order and as a vision of a better society. Quote, the central idea underlying the industrial movement is the establishment of economic systems that will ensure equivalence of service in the exchanges and business transactions between man and man, McCune wrote. He explained that, quote, the expenditure of labor and production means the expenditure of a part of the life forces in the product. A portion of the toiler's life is blended, woven, and embodied in every article of wealth he produces. Those stately mansions that line our streets, those piles of goods that fill those warehouses, all this wealth really means so many human lives crystallized by labor. At its core, the Subtreasury Plan represented an ideal market society in which commercial exchange, as Proudhon also suggested, would be the vehicle for the fulfillment of the Christian ideal of mutuality and, quote, reciprocity. Quote, under an equitable exchange system, every worker would receive for his product or services an equitable amount of the labor or services, that is, the life of others. Under an unjust system of exchange, he is robbed of a part of his life, McCune wrote. Denouncing what he called economic cannibalism, he concluded, monopolists manufacture the muscle, blood, and brain of the workers into wealth without rendering an adequate return. While McCune's hopes for a democratization of the means of market relations were largely disappointed, the ideal he had championed endured. When he was pushed out of the Farmers' Alliance at the age of 42, he had spent less than 7 years in the agrarian cause, and he never re-entered the fray of national political debate. His father had been a pastor, and after a few years practicing both law and medicine in the mid-1890s, McCune himself became licensed to preach. He spent the first 2 decades of the 20th century working as an itinerant supply preacher for a circuit of small, impoverished towns and districts in central Texas, the same communities that had been at the heart of his politics. He joined his son, also a Methodist minister, in missionary work in northern Mexico, and he ended his career as pastor for a church in Miami, Arizona. Amid the defeat or co-optation of its broadest political aims, the agrarian movement channeled much of its imaginative energy and spirit into the evangelical church. But its cause was not utopian in any pie-in-the-sky sense. From a sustained and sophisticated engagement with the changing political economy of Southern farming, McCune drew a deeply democratic vision of the possibilities of large-scale industrial agriculture and finance liberated from what he called the power of money to oppress. Thanks very much.
Yeah, great. So thanks for being here and for indulging us. I'm basically going to channel a book that I've got coming out that sort of connects up sort of an ancient ideology of the sort of American Republic on the one hand with contemporary thinking about money and banking on the other. So I start with a couple of premises and then I sort of elaborate. The first is that the word republic that we use a lot in our discourse, and even in the word republican and all the variants thereof, used to have a sort of a rich and resonant meaning, some of which has been sort of lost, I think, in a lot of contemporary folk. So the founders who began talking about a republic back in the early days of this republic had something quite specific in mind that was sort of handed down by the sort of official ideologists, you might say, of the ancient Roman Republic prior to Rome's becoming imperial. And roughly what they had in mind was the idea of a society of roughly equally endowed people who were sort of materially independent. That's to say that each citizen more or less had the wherewithal to be self-sustaining, economically speaking, or again, materially speaking. There's a kind of an autarky idea, sort of something vaguely like autarky. And the Republic was the res publica, right, a public thing. It was basically meant to be that instrumentality through which these free and materially independent people could work together to address legitimate collective action problems that required collective address. But otherwise, they would be more or less autonomous individuals, autonomous citizens. This ideology was sort of reawakened, you might say, during the Renaissance period. Machiavelli, a couple of other important Italian thinkers and historians sort of recovered the ideology of the old Roman Republic. Their writings were quite exciting to a number of people in the north of Europe. So the Dutch Republic was self-consciously formed around the idea of the ancient Roman Republic. Those ideas, the same ideas then migrated over across the Channel into the British Isles. A number of very important thinkers of the sort of early modern era, in particular James Harrington and Lord Bolingbroke were popularizers of the idea of the British Isles. These ideas migrated across the Atlantic with the peopling of the North American continent, at least part of it by those who came from the British Isles. And that's the very reason that you find the word republic throughout the writings of the founders, both in their sort of public writings, they're sort of controversializing over the new Constitution, and in their private writings. It's also why you find a clause in the U.S. Constitution which is known to lawyers as the Guarantee Clause, pursuant to which the federal government undertakes to guarantee to each of the states a Republican form of government. They're not talking about Abraham Lincoln, they're not talking about George Bush, they're talking about a very specific meaning behind the word republicanism. Now, that's sort of our ideological heritage, you might say, and that's why we say, and to the republic for which it stands, and blah, blah, blah. The other thing, another important part of our sort of ideological tradition, I think, it seems to be, that kind of connects up with our Republican tradition, is a tendency to sort of favor stocks over flows, if I can use sort of financial language for a moment, to favor old property over new property. What I mean by that is when it comes to sort of securing the means of material independence among the citizenry, we tend naturally, I suppose, to think in terms of securing ownership of productive assets to the citizenry, rather than to, say, guaranteeing rights to incomes of one kind or another, whether it be, say, universal basic income or some other kind of income generating legal arrangement. We seem to have a tendency to prefer income that comes from the ownership of particular assets, whatever those might be, hence this reference to stocks over flows. Here too, you find this preference registered in a number of different sort of spheres of American life. For one thing, our law tends to favor stocks over flows, or tends to favor old property over new property, right? So real estate ownership is very secure and stable as a matter of American law, whereas your right or your entitlement, say, to welfare payments, although that is property in the sense that Charles Wright kind of famously called it, the so-called new property, it's less secure property in the sense that Bill Clinton will, quite happily and blithely change the welfare laws and end welfare as we know it, and thereby take away what had become a form of new property, in Charles Wright's words. But you wouldn't see, probably, Bill Clinton sort of suddenly changing the law of title to real estate or title to other forms of physical property. So as a matter of sort of American law, we tend to favor, it seems, older forms of property over newer forms, or against stocks over flows. That preference seems to cohere nicely with, or resonate nicely with, Republican ideology as well. This sort of ancient Roman Republican ideology, which tended to be very sort of land-focused, or developed during a time when land ownership was the primary form of productive or remunerative ownership. And it seems that it might even be a part of our psychology. There might be a kind of deep, sort of hardwired tendency pursuant to, in our sort of what I call endowment psychology, to sort of favor owned assets over rights to income flows from one source or another. Now, this tendency to sort of favor stocks over flows and to sort of think of ourselves as Republicans or as constituting a republic found expression in American public policy for many, many decades, and I would argue that it even finds expression in public policy to this day. If you sort of focus on the 19th century, in particular, late 18th through the 19th century, we seem to have decided, either consciously or subconsciously, either deliberately or cognizantly on the one hand, or perhaps just sort of implicitly on the other hand, to sort of put in place a kind of what I think of as a sort of a three-legged stool of a kind of owners or producers republic. On the one hand, we adopted policies and legal reforms that seem to be designed to spread the ownership of land quite widely over the population. That's to say the Anglo or the European population that came and took the land from the prior inhabitants. Also to spread a certain kind of productive capital that might be distinguished from land conceptually, even if sometimes, as a matter of practical reality, there's a kind of coinciding, and I'll explain in a moment. And then human capital as well. So for example, when you think of land in particular, some of the very earliest changes that the American colonists made to English real property law was to abandon fee tail, which was a form of land tenure that kept land within families, tended to sort of concentrate it within families. They abandoned that quite quickly, apparently to encourage a kind of a broad spread of the ownership of land, which was the preeminent productive resource of the period. After that, of course, in the sort of late mid 19th century, probably most famously, the Homestead Act spread land very widely over the citizenry to anybody who could make the land productive. Most people have heard of, or at least know something about the Homestead Act. What many people don't seem to know is that there wasn't a single Homestead Act, there was a sequence of Homestead Acts, the last of which was passed in the early mid-20th century rather than the 19th. And again, the idea was to keep spreading land that had not yet fallen under individual citizen ownership among a broader and broader swathe of the citizenry. It seems like fewer people have heard of the Land Grant Acts than have heard of the Homestead Acts, but the Land Grant Acts were passed concurrently with the Homestead Acts, and these were a package deal, so to speak, you might say. The idea of the Land Grant Acts was to spread human capital as widely as we were spreading land. The idea here was to spread human capital in a way that enabled people to make that land productive. So the so-called land grant universities are, of course, the best known product of that period, which of course include agricultural extension programs in every state where you find land grant institutions. Being from Cornell myself, I'm particularly interested in land grant institutions. I'm employed by one. But in any event, so the idea here then was to spread, again, you might say, a kind of human capital as widely as we were spreading land. The other thing that's worth noting, I think, about this period was at this time, two of the legs of the three-legged stools, I'm calling it, were in effect provided by one resource, namely land. So land, as long as the economy was primarily agrarian, land was not only to spread a kind of habitations or livable homes, but was also to spread the preeminent sort of productive resource of the time, or at least one of the primary productive resources of the time. So you could sort of say that by spreading land, the homestead and land grants were spreading a kind of non-human capital at the same time that they were spreading something, a resource on which people would live, right, land or homes. And so during the 19th century and up until around the end of the 19th century, it was plausible to suggest that we were a kind of producer's republic, or we had public policies that were designed or well calculated to sort of providing the kind of underpinnings of a sort of producer republic by spreading widely shelter on the one hand, a productive resource in the form of land on the other hand, and again, kind of human capital on the other hand. As we reached the end of the 19th century, however, there were a couple of problems that emerged for this grand scheme. One was the land, of course, began to run out, right? Once we got over to the Pacific, once the so-called manifest destiny had been realized and we had reached the Pacific, there really wasn't much more land to spread unless we were going to go and conquer more peoples and commit more genocide, and so we'd get more land to spread more widely. We obviously didn't quite do that. The other problem, of course, that emerged was that the economy shifted steadily away from being primarily agrarian in orientation and became increasingly industrial. And what that meant was that as the 20th century opened up, we had spread, a certain form of human capital widely. We had spread land widely, but we were no longer spreading what you might think of as industrial capital or non-human capital as widely, at least not usable non-human capital, because land, again, was less able to serve as a kind of non-human capital. That led to a certain form of instability that I think, in a way, you can think of as being the primary challenge that we faced in the 20th century without ever quite naming it. So the way I describe this is as follows. There is a tendency, under some circumstances, for an economy to lurch into a kind of stasis or into crisis when its absorptive capacity fails to keep up with its productive capacity, right? When people who are producing things are no longer able to purchase those things at the same rate at which they can produce them, you have a long-term tendency toward a kind of crisis proneness, you might say. In effect, what I call this is the language I adopt for this to sort of explain what happens here is I use the term what I call the income compositional symmetry principle. So the idea is this. Let's say that labor accounts for 10% of value added in a given economy. And let's say capital accounts for 90% of value added in a macroeconomy. If individuals themselves derive, if a large portion of the population derives most of its income from labor rather than from capital, there's going to be a long-term tendency for that macroeconomy's absorptive capacity to be outrun by its productive capacity, right? That basically the way to maintain a kind of macroeconomic stability, a kind of an equivalence between absorptive capacity on the one hand and productive capacity on the other, is to ensure that each individual's income composition more or less matches that of the macroeconomy, right? So every individual is in effect a kind of a microcosm of the macroeconomy. So what that would mean is, again, if 90% of value added in the economy comes from capital, then each of us as an individual would derive 90% of his or her income from capital. And if only 10% is accounted for by labor, then each of us would derive about 10% of his or her income from labor. The farther you depart from that form of income compositional symmetry, I argue, the more likely you are to kind of go out of balance in the sense that the economy's productive capacity will tend to outrun its absorptive capacity. In other words, you'll have a tendency to sort of move into stasis, you'll have a tendency to move into secular stagnation, you'll have periodic crises or sort of so-called overproduction or underconsumption, which of course were two ways of describing the same crisis that many political economists began to talk about in the later part of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. So the question becomes, how do you then address income compositional asymmetry if it emerges as a serious problem, as it seems to have done in this country starting in the 20th century, when it had not been so serious a problem in the 19th century, precisely, again, because we had spread productive assets widely. We had spread widely the assets that were the primary productive assets of the period, right, given the level of economic development that we had reached in the 19th century. Seems to me there are basically two ways. One way is legally to change the comparative returns to labor and capital, right? So, you know, when we talk about, say, you know, 90% of value added in an economy being accounted for by capital and 10% by labor, or whatever the comparative percentages are, that's not a fact that's not a sort of a natural fact, right? That's not written into the sort of code of the universe or anything. That's a legal artifact, right? The fact that, the thing that makes it possible, right, for capital to earn higher returns than labor is, of course, capital scarcity, or, you know, engineered, we might say legally engineered or legally protected capital scarcity on the one hand, and legally retained labor abundance or overabundance on the other, right? In other words, if capital is scarce or kept scarce by law, then those who own capital can act as rentier and charge a lot for the use of that capital. If labor, for its part, I'll wrap up in just a couple seconds. So the returns to labor and capital are legal artifacts, right? So one possibility then to address income compositional asymmetry would be legally to change, right, the returns that can be had by labor or by capital, either by, you know, taxing away capital incomes, by deploying public capital to render capital no longer scarce, to facilitate collective bargaining by labor, basically labor law, to enable labor to essentially become rentiers, collective rentiers in the way that capital suppliers were rentiers. That's one way to do it, right? And we did take steps in that direction, or at various times in 20th century history did something kind of like that. But the other possibility would be to essentially enable or use public capital to enable individuals more readily to become capital owners themselves, right? So you'd say, okay, instead of counteracting capital scarcity or enabling greater labor scarcity through law, we might say, okay, we'll accept the given return, the returns that capital earns now, and we'll accept the returns that labor earns now, but we will collectively act to spread a wider ownership of productive capital, basically a kind of 21st century analog to the spreading of land that we did when it was the productive capital, so to speak, in the 19th century. And there are various ways to do that that make use of public finance, or the means of public finance, and make use of public credit. And the book that I've mentioned, it'll come out later this spring, it's called A Republic of Owners, is largely, or a significant portion of the book is devoted to sort of mapping out various ways to do this. And one of the ways is through a particular proposal that a few of us have been working on of late, and I think Joseph in particular is going to talk a bit more about that specific proposal. So I'll stop there since I'm out of time, and since that makes for a great segue to Joseph. Okay.
It's up to y'all, but we had Lenore going first, so.
You're the chair.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon. I really appreciate everyone's patience. I know it's 5:45. I can see the energy in the room starting to go a little down. People are getting hungry, so I'll try to be relatively brief in the hopes that we really can sustain our energy through for some discussion and conversation, which is usually the most interesting part. So I, really appreciate both of these presentations, and I'm really honored to be here, especially with two of my favorite public intellectuals sitting over here. I'm going to talk, sort of jump off a little bit, I think, from Bob's presentation, and I think maybe, hopefully not duplicate anything Joseph will say, but talk about this idea of what it would look like for corporations to also be democratic economic institutions, right? So the framework of this conference is, as I read it, that recognizing money and credit as public products, right, that expose democratic purpose and possibility. We should know that public power creates money, which has been the discussion in, so much of the conference, but it also structures corporations, right? Corporations themselves, our largest business entities, are creatures of public permission. They don't exist unless you get that stamp, right, from a Secretary of State or what have you on your certificate of incorporation or articles of incorporation, right? And it's striking to me actually how much so many people that I work with don't even sort of realize this. They think, oh, corporation, LLC, whatever, different types of businesses. But when we recognize the immense privileges that we give to corporations of limited liability and everything else that we could list off, we have to recognize that that is a grant from the public, right? It's a democratic creation. And so because of that, we should understand corporate law and corporate governance rules as rules that we as a society should create in the best interest of society, right? Over the past 40 years, we've been captured by this idea of maximizing shareholder value. We don't have time to see many nodding heads. Of course, most people I would bet in this room know sort of the history from the Chicago School on in terms of creating this framework that we could spend a whole different conference exploring why it's just incorrect on so many levels, right? Why it's incorrect as a legal matter, why it's sort of empty as an economic matter. But if we sort of stop there and don't actually explore what the what would it actually look like to produce corporate law that actually takes societal benefit as its North Star, I don't think we've done enough. So I sort of take that as the question for this conversation. So, I'll maybe just say one quick word about what's wrong with shareholder primacy, just because that's something that I'm sort of obsessed with right now. Shareholder primacy is just another way to say that people think that law states that the ultimate goal of all corporate activity should be shareholder wealth creation, right? So what has that justified? That's justified in this year, $1 trillion being spent on stock buybacks or open market share repurchases by our largest corporations. So a stock buyback is a tool that corporations use to repurchase their own stock in order to have the value of stocks that remain on the market rise in value automatically without having to do anything productive to improve their profits or anything else, right? And there's a lot of different issues that I could talk about what I think are wrong with stock buybacks. But I think that just to give as a counterpoint, we spend about $3.25 trillion in this country per year on healthcare, right? So 1/3 of the amount of money we're spending on healthcare is going towards this goal of simply enriching shareholders while doing nothing else to improve corporate productivity. That's kind of an astounding fact and shows how far, I think, how far along shareholder primacy is as an entrenched framework and practice for corporate behavior. So if we sort of take that as a starting point for where we are, I think it's good to hear about some of the movements in the past and their aspirational goals, even if they didn't fail. The question to me is really, what should some of the aspirational goals be that actually would restructure corporations so that they're actually productive for the society? And I should say, I work at a policy think tank. I sort of think about policy on two different levels. I think there's the policies that we're working on the day-to-day, that I hope might become reality in 2021, and those are, really important. But then I think there's the deeper, more sort of profound level of what are the types of real policy restructuring of our entire economy that, I think is more the subject of this conversation. So I'm going to talk about just two areas of policy that are more in the aspirational and less in the nuts and bolts, just for the purposes of right now. So the first is the question of how actually should corporate governance work, right? We have as this framework, okay, shareholders elect the board, its fiduciary duties run only to shareholders, huge literature contesting that. But what would it actually look like to set things up in a different way? One way to structure corporate behavior is through stakeholder corporate governance, right? Stakeholder corporate governance is this idea that I think to those of us in the US, even those of us who are active in sort of progressive politics, it's like completely radical, completely insane, right? So we should just start by knowing that it's actually pretty common in different forms throughout much of Europe and other nations. But it's basically the idea that there's different groups of actors who actually contribute to the success of a corporation, right? It's actually not just shareholders. So you sort of step back and think, well, if all other groups fell away, what would be left? Would there be a functioning business enterprise that would produce stuff and sell it to customers? No, there would not, right? There's different groups of stakeholders. There's employees, there's customers, and there's the public. So an idea of stakeholder corporate governance is just quite simply that all stakeholder groups should have a voice inside corporate governance. and that the responsibility of the board of directors should run actually to those multiple groups of stakeholders rather than just to shareholders. This is a piece of policy that actually Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed earlier this year called the Accountable Capitalism Act. The elements of it are, one, as I said, there should be stakeholder representation on boards, and the board's fiduciary duty should run to all stakeholders. A third component of it is really how we understand corporate purpose, right? You, as I do some, in my legal work, if you write down what the purpose is on an articles of incorporation, it's just any lawful purpose, right? We don't have to say anything when we're creating a corporation that it should serve the society. So part of a third element of the policy change here would be to actually institutionalize an understanding that corporations must have some kind of material positive benefit for the society. I think the work that's gone on over the last couple of years to create the benefit corporation movement, where over 35 states, I think now, have passed statutes that allow corporations to opt into this framework, is really important. But because it's an opt-in, we know it's never going to be transformational, right? It's never going to, it's going to be something that always appeals to just a select group. Another, I think, interesting question for us right now, we're in this conference and we're talking about these deep, profound public policy issues, but we're, I haven't actually heard climate change or sort of the climate disaster come up here today, which I think is actually no longer something that we can keep separate from any other conversation, just for all the reasons we all know. So an interesting question to me when we talk about stakeholder corporate governance, I think it's clear why employees contribute to the corporation, right? And why our public policy should actually situate employees as a critical stakeholder within the corporation. What about the broader public? If we understand now that corporations, because of the lack of requirements on them to actually internalize their externalities that they're creating on the society, if they have created this catastrophic circumstance in which we all may die, right? Not to be dramatic about it, but that's sort of established at this point. What then should the role of the public be as a stakeholder inside the corporation, right? How do we actually concretize that? I think it's something that's really going to be critical to engage with as we look at more and more at how climate change is going to evolve. I think it raises all kinds of interesting legal and sort of pragmatic questions about how would you actually institutionalize stakeholder corporate governance beyond employees. So in other words, how do you actually include not only customers maybe or supply chain members, but how do you actually include the broader public? What would that really look like in stakeholder corporate governance? So that's sort of one area for reform. And then I'll just close by saying I think the other area of reform that has to be integrated here is employee ownership. And I'm going to mostly leave that to Joseph, because for me to pretend to talk about employee ownership when Joseph is here would be kind of silly. But I'm just going to mention, I think, one aspect of it. So, so I work at the Roosevelt Institute, and then I also do a little bit of legal work with worker cooperatives and employee-owned businesses. And I think there's a moment right now where there's tremendous growth and energy around the employee ownership movement. Much of it is concentrated in small to medium-sized businesses, right? And much of it is about sort of in the here and now, how do we actually, create the potential for financing and potential for scale that's so necessary? I think a question when we're sort of at this more abstract level is, what about public policy that actually would mandate some level of employee ownership to go along with stakeholder corporate governance? Should we have stakeholder corporate ownership, right? What would that actually look like? So in the UK earlier this year, in the summer, the Labour Party proposed something called the Inclusive Ownership Fund, which is basically a requirement that all corporations with, I believe, over 250 or maybe 500 employees actually over time transfer ownership to their employees up to 10% of the corporate shares outstanding. They have a process by which this would happen, and I think it raises all kinds of interesting questions if you actually were talking about a sort of political moment in which we could enact something like that, right? Then we'd have to figure out a lot of details. But I think as a framework question, to actually recognize again that employees and maybe the public as a stakeholder are, should have sort of co-determinative power within corporate law and corporate ownership, I think is a really just important way to understand this broader project we're engaged with here about how the public actually should structure the economy and structure economic relations. So I'll close with that.
So, thank you very much. Delighted to be here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our book called The Citizen Share, Reducing Inequality in the 21st Century. Richard Freeman of the Economics Department here at Harvard was a collaborator, along with Doug Cruz, who's my colleague at Rutgers, also an economist. One of the things I did for the book was use the University of Virginia Rotunda project on the writings of the founders to do a very systematic analysis of this thesis that Robert also spoke about, where many of them believed that broad-based property ownership was absolutely essential for a democratic republic to exist. And I have my own way of summarizing this ethos, which is that they were interested in modest taxes, small government, and broad-based property ownership, which enabled individual economic liberty. Now, the current Republican Party and some parts of the current conservative movement have forgotten the third there, right? And in fact, if you look closely and do a textual analysis at the Rotunda Project, the University of Virginia, the founders' writings, they actually believed that the broad-based property ownership produced smaller government and produced modest taxes, and as Robert said, produced economic liberty. Obviously, many of them either committed or bought into or allowed the great evil of women's exclusion from civic life and slavery. Hopefully we've made some progress, a lot of progress, maybe in some areas, very little progress in other areas. During Washington's period of policy, and up until the Homestead Act, I want to stress this, even before the Homestead Act, there were a variety of methods to use credit arrangements and essentially even late payments arrangements, which effectively were like credit arrangements, right? You could acquire land under a lot of policies pre-Homestead Act by paying, you got the acquisition and you could pay later in installments. It was effectively a credit arrangement to make this broad-based property ownership spread. Again, with the limitations of the horrible racial and gender discrimination, although I do want to point out that the Homestead Act did allow women to be involved. Women entrepreneurs were a big part of the Homestead Act. In fact, there is a special part of the national park system devoted to celebrating one woman entrepreneur. And if you email me, I'll send you directions how to go there. We took our children there. Now, for me, and what marks the sort of dividing point in my book is I talk about James Madison, who, after he became president, was at the rewriting of the Virginia Constitution, and as it were, I'm colloquializing. He took out a piece of paper, and he said, "How much land will there be in the United States in 100 years? How many people will there be?" He divided one by the other, and he realized that the sort of landed republic was not doable. So how would you do that? And the answer really came from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Galusha Grow, radical anti-slavery Republican of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who basically said when he retired from the speakership after managing the Homestead Act for Lincoln through the Congress, Galusha Grow said basically there isn't enough land, it has to come through capital shares and corporations. And so that's what I'm going to talk about very briefly. So the reality we have, quickly, relatively flat or declining real wages, 75% of household wealth, and 95% of all capital income, including all capital gains, so that's all interest, dividends, and capital gains, concentrated in the top 10% of households, according to the Piketty-Saya-Zuckman recent figures. We are, folks, at English level feudalism numbers. Let's just not in any way confuse ourselves. Education and training cannot quickly dig most of the population out of this feudalism with the Constitution, which is what our system is right now. Returns to education are not up for real wages in with many areas of education. 95 of 160 million people are not involved in a workplace where there's any question of reskilling. Technological unemployment is now recognized as something that is real. And it would be very hard to stage an education and training program because of the different places where people are at. So what do you do with the people, men and women who are 65 and should be retiring but they can't support themselves? Okay. So we need a paradigm change. The post-World War II wage system cannot reverse economic inequality. The fixed wage system for changing economic inequality is irretrievably broken. It is simply a mathematical impossibility with these concentration of capital ownership and concentration of capital income numbers to use the real wage, fixed wage system to significantly impact economic inequality. So a policy choice is to supplement the wage system and any training and education efforts, I'm not against them, with broadening shares of capital ownership and capital income. So capital shares at the workplace for 160 million workers, and as citizens, we need capital shares for 95 million who are not in the workforce. In other words, if capital income is so highly concentrated and capital ownership is so highly concentrated, once you remove the wage system as a way to deal with economic inequality, you're only logically left with broadening capital shares. What are your other alternatives? Your other alternatives are some form, extreme form of socialism or communism, which stands as a political alternative. Your other alternative is to go further down the road to feudalism and have enhanced feudalism with the Constitution. And your other alternative is Piketty-level taxes, so 70–80% taxes on income and 1 to 3% taxes on wealth every year, which I think we're going to have a hard time with any various combination of politicians to pass. I tell you that capital shares, in one word, a policy of shares, is consistent with the kind of American ideology that we've been talking about, and also is something that is possibly politically palatable and even bipartisan. So very, very quickly, shares at work for the 160 million workers. Revise tax incentives and federal contracts so every firm will seriously consider all forms of capital share programs. Profit sharing, equity participation programs in every sector for every format. So just to give you an example, grants of restricted stock units are used in high tech. Okay, we need to get the tax laws and the federal contract purchasing advantages set up so every high tech company wants to grant every worker those. In small business, families want to control 100% of their equity. They like to do profit sharing. I drafted the profit sharing tax incentive that Secretary Clinton used in her campaign, and that would have had profit sharing spread rapidly through small businesses. In private equity, the carried interest, special carried interest tax advantage for private equity should be withdrawn unless they have a broad-based profit sharing or employee share ownership plan for their portfolio companies, period, the end. The public stock market company, the removal of a small tax incentive by the first Bush administration, which eliminated employee share ownership, large employee ownership plans in stock market companies, needs to be reversed. I will say one thing. I am against what I will call Enron forms of employee ownership. It should be illegal for workers in ERISA plans to purchase their company stock. Everything I'm talking about is grants of profits, shares, and grants of stock options. You know what? Getting land in the Homestead Act, if you visit this woman's national park monument, that was risky for her and her children. Capital is risky, but it should be granted, not bought. So Robert Hockett has talked about a program, a massive credit program to encourage employee ownership of retiring business owners in publicly traded companies. This is a program that I think is very worthwhile and would push this forward. But one of the things I think that Bob's program responds to is that by changing federal contracts and by changing tax incentives, that's not enough. You need a massive program to allow workers' trusts, employee trusts to buy existing companies. Finally, let me end with the other part of this. Shares for citizens, the 95 million who don't work. We need federal legislation to enable citizens' trusts in all of the 50 states to acquire income-producing assets and pay dividends to citizens. Like the Alaska Permanent Fund, paying dividends recently of between $1,000 and $1,500 a year for every woman, man, and child. I would call it universal capital accounts. It would be financed, unlike Alaska, which is financed from carbon, as you know, by grants from federal and state governments, seed grants, but then mainly by credit, okay? Mainly by credit. That's why I'm talking about this here at a monetary policy conference, where the income on assets that they buy with the credit would be enough to repay the loans and fund the dividends to citizens. Okay, we need federal legislation to make this possible in every state. I'd like a little tax incentive there. I'd like to give Warren Buffett a tax incentive to contribute billions of dollars to the state citizen trust funds of Mississippi, Alabama, and other states which might not be able to get the billions they need. So we're, at our institute at Rutgers, we're establishing a new program called the Attenborough Fellowships, which I passed around to begin to sort of study how to do this. So, do I have any time left, or am I done?
You have 4 minutes left.
Okay, so this is a codfish, and appropriate here in Massachusetts. So, the book This Isn't Share, in chapter 1, opens with the story after the American Revolution of the cod fishery, which was one of the largest exports of the colonies, and would be important for the fiscal stability of the new government, with President Washington calling Thomas Jefferson into his office, the new Secretary of State, and basically said, you got to save the cod industry, right? The British had destroyed the ships, the warehouses, arrested the sailors, because as John Adams said, the cod fishery was the nursery of the American Navy, okay? So, so what Jefferson ended up doing is a bill was passed in Congress. Senator Cabot from Massachusetts was central in this, which said that based on the size that cod ships go out into Georgia's Bank, they will receive a special, essentially, tax credit, an allowance paid directly by the Treasury, monetary policy. But that 5/8 of this allowance would be paid in cash to the workers, and 3/8 only to the ship owners. If you look into the report on the American fisheries in Thomas Jefferson's hand, which he wrote, at the beginning of this whole debate, the shipping owners of Massachusetts sent Jefferson a letter, and it says, "Dear Thomas Jefferson, just send the entire tax credit to us." It's like right there within the first 4 pages. And there had been profit sharing in the cod industry since the late 1600s, right? The whole catch, all the fishermen. And so the bill that passed Congress said 2 things: that the credit was 5/8 to the workers, 3/8 to the crew. It also said that the captain of every ship, now look, we're talking about the 1790s, had to get every sailor on the ship, even the cabin boy, and there were probably some cabin girls there, get every sailor on the ship to sign a written contract before it went out into the water, saying that in addition to this division of the credit, that there would be broad-based profit sharing on the entire catch, and next to every person's name had to be their share, okay? And that was part of American law for many decades. And really, I guess what I'm talking about is updating that kind of approach with a one-word but new paradigm policy. Shares for all workers at businesses, and shares for all citizens. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I was going to mute the screen, but I think that's an appropriate backdrop. So I just wanted to...
It's too embarrassing, so take it off. It was meant to flash for a second.
I will beat it then. So I just wanted to put one question to the panel before we open it up to the rest of the room. This conference, I think, as a whole, at least one main purpose of it is to create discourse around a new framing of money, and like obviously money as a democratic medium. And something that is particularly evident in Professor Sklansky's presentation is that at one point, and actually in this room earlier today, someone pointed out that one of the main obstacles to this money as a democratic medium idea is this ignorance on the public. You know, we're excluded from discussions of money. But in the populist movement, you know, you had a widespread education around monetary issues, and not just, you know, there was the populist agrarian revolt, which was very large scale, and then even beyond that, you have the 1896 election, which focused entirely around money issues. And I would just want to put it to the panel, to what would you attribute the disappearance of that? Is it just that, you know, why aren't people more involved in the monetary debates today? What's the reason for the shift in understanding? And is it that the system is more complicated, or is there something else at play? So whoever wants to start.
So I can throw out one. I mean, it seems to me that there's been a kind of a tendency to, over the last, maybe the second half of the 20th century, to kind of forget about what money actually is and sort of what it emanates from, right? What the sources of it are. I mean, it used to be apparently orthodoxy among people who looked at banks or who knew about banks to recognize that banks were money issuing entities, that basically banks issued credit money. Banks did not simply act as intermediaries. They didn't simply redistribute sort of previously accumulated capital or previously accumulated scarce capital. There seemed to be a wide understanding that banks, in a certain sense, issued capital of a certain kind, right, money capital. And that in essence, money, the sort of the credit core of money was really the essence of money, right? And so at some point around the 1950s, it seems, the discipline of economics kind of flipped over into this belief that what banks do is essentially intermediate scarce capital, right? That they have to receive deposits before they can actually lend money, which is, again, just flatly false. If you look at any bank lending transaction this very day, you'll see right away that it's false, right? But somehow or another, this orthodoxy took hold of the economics profession, it seems around the 1950s or so, maybe late 1950s. And ever since then, it seems that people, including progressives, have just sort of left money alone. It's either too recondite or it's an uncomfortable subject because they fear that as soon as it's brought up, that's going to lead into the next round of observations to the effect that, well, we can't do this because it's going to be too expensive, or it's going to crowd out capital, or it's going to elicit the revenge of the bond vigilantes, or what have you, right? So we seem to steer away from, progressives seem to steer away from money, I think partly for that reason.
I can add, yeah, I think, excuse me, to add to that, I think social movements broadly in the last however many decades, if you're talking about economic inequality, you're talking about wages and working people's power. And so much, rightly, of our energy has gone to supporting collective bargaining and supporting fights for unionization. And as that struggle has evolved, I think for many progressives, the focus has been on how to maintain union power as a source of working people's power. And so I think that's obviously essentially important, but it's taken, I think, some attention away from other questions of, for example, capital share, or how do we actually engage with business in a different way. And I think another piece of that is that for many people who are concerned with social inequality and economic inequality, there's no sense that you actually can be part of a business. Right, your experience is so far away from actually being part of a business that's very hard to understand how you would actually engage with the business as an actor, and then take it another further step, how you would actually understand yourself as being part of a public that has some sort of power vis-a-vis banks, right? How incredibly disempowered do people feel vis-a-vis the financial system? So I think that there is a lack of there's a lot of substantive lack of awareness, but there's also just choices, I think strategic choices the social movements have made that I think is actually changing. I think that's part of why this conference is here. There's so many incredible thinkers right now doing important work in this space, and social movements are really holding on to that in a way that I think is very exciting.
Do you want to chime in, Professor Spencer?
Sure. Your question reminds me of one of the reasons that I got into, that I became interested in writing about the history of money, and it had to do with what I saw as a kind of profound gulf of understanding between my students and the subjects that we were studying. When, simply put, it was hard for my students, and it remains hard for them to relate on a visceral level to the passion and intensity with which early Americans debated about what feel to us today like arcane and technical questions about bimetallism, for example, or the Bank of the United States. And I tell my students, Coins Financial School was not written for people like you because you're in college. It was written for people without a college, who didn't go to college, and it was a huge bestseller, like William Googe's short history of banking in America in the 1830s. So there is something to be said, I think, about what happened to popular economic theory that is not popular thought about how do I do well within the system, but popular theorizing about the system itself. And I think it's a complicated story with money. In part, it seems to me it has to do with decisive defeats. I mean, that is the ways in which bank-controlled money ceases to seem like a truly open question in the absence of genuine systemic alternatives after the early 20th century. But it's also bound up with the way in which I think maybe like Robert, you were saying, the realm of economics in general becomes relegated to experts, and in particular, the monetary system and monetary policy in particular comes to be regarded as a kind of expert preserve. So those are some things.
Yeah, so I think that, speaking more broadly, I've been sort of looking over American history to try to understand this. I think the three wars, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, helped concentrate the power of capital, increase the power of big capitalists, increase the size of the federal government, which became a oligarchy supporting this group. And a lot of the kind of proposals that you talked about, that you alluded to, that you would like to see, became kind of impossible in this kind of discourse. The Red Scare, whatever it was and however it was created and put together and based in fact or fiction, shortcut a lot of these discussions. And then boom, we get to the post-war period, huge economic growth. Pension funds, union power, non-union firms like IBM imitating unions with good benefits and good wages, and then we get sort of seduced by this notion that I've spoke against, that the fixed wage system and the fixed defined benefit pension system does it, right? And unions and non-union companies imitating unions sort of does it. And then I think all of labor economics gets sort of like drawn up in this, not just a historical fact, but an ideology. This becomes an ideology for labor economics. So that's why you can go to a labor economist conference with 100 labor economists in the room, and they're still talking about how we can get the wage system and skills training to solve these feudalism level numbers that Piketty is telling us about. So that's why we need a paradigm change. But it started in the Civil War, this sort of diminution of the kinds of ethos that we've all been discussing.
There's an irony here too, can I throw in really quickly? I mean, given the importance of the Civil War period and the two world wars, right? I mean, there's a really profound irony here, because the Civil War is about the time that our banking system became a kind of public-private franchise, right? In other words, basically, as soon as the National Bank Act was passed and we created a system of nationally chartered banks, that were now issuing not their own banknotes, but something called the greenback, which was a national currency. And they were under the control of the comptroller of the currency, and of course comptroller is an archaic English term for controller. We basically converted the banking system into a kind of public-private franchise, where the issuer is actually the public. And these private institutions are basically disseminating the product. Basically, instead of poison hamburgers, they're putting out greenbacks, right? And you've got a kind of a quality control officer, which is what a franchisor typically is in the form of the OCC. So that's the first irony. The second irony is that then when we get to the First and Second World War period, we actually created the world's largest financial institution by far, which was a public institution. It was first called the War Finance Corporation to help mobilize finance to basically mobilize the First World War effort. That WFC became what a much bigger institution during the New Deal period called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, which was a gigantic public investment bank. And again, its balance sheet in its heyday dwarfed that of all the Wall Street institutions combined. So the irony here is that we actually recognize the centrality of the public to the money system, to the financial system, to the banking system. We recognize the sort of franchise nature of the financial system, with the public as the franchisor and the individual financial institutions as franchisees during those particular war periods, first the Civil War, then the First and Second World War, and the period in between. And yet that's also a time that, as Joseph points out, the ideology begins to change, where we're sort of thinking of banks as intermediaries rather than generators of credit or credit money.
All right, let's open up for questions. Start with Chris down here.
I would like to see if we can get Robert to talk about his big new policy idea that takes the stuff into the 21st century that you ended with in your talk and that Joseph alluded to.
Yeah, so I don't want to go into great detail just because we're sort of short of time, and I think I've talked too much already, but I mean, one key here is that if you look at what did we do in the 20th century when the land did run out? Well, we adopted we basically developed means that used public credit to keep spreading ownership of two of the legs of the three-legged stools, I was calling it, right? All of the mortgage finance innovations were also developed in the very late Hoover and then the Roosevelt administrations. And they basically made use of, they substituted public credit for private credit, precisely because public credit was much more reliable, was much more widely accepted. And so we publicly financed a very broad distribution of homeowning. People often don't seem to realize that before the 1930s, fewer than 40% of American households owned their own homes. By the time you got into the late 30s, early 40s, we had reached nearly 2/3. And about a 65 to 66% homeownership rate among our public seems to be sustainable. We only got into trouble when we tried to push the envelope a bit further and notch it up to 67 or 68%, which is what we did in the late Clinton and early Bush years. That's what turned out to be unsustainable. We adopted essentially the same financial engineering means to spread higher education. We actually patterned our system of higher education finance after our system of home finance about 20 years later. Sputnik seems to have been the impetus, right? 1957, the communists sent a satellite up into space. We don't seem to have the capacity to do it yet. 3 or 4 of the rockets that we try to send into space with satellites blow up. Quite embarrassingly, we think, oh, we need to engage in something like the moral equivalent of war to spread higher education more widely. And it's no accident that probably the best known secondary market maker for education loans is named a name that sort of resonates with the best known of the secondary market makers in mortgage loans. Fannie Mae, Sallie Mae. The Mae is not an accident, right? So one way to put the plans in the book that I sort of put out are basically involve other Mays, you might say, to try to spread capital. You basically, again, substituting public credit for private credit in order to spread ownership in firms much more widely on the basis of a number of different patronage relations that people have with firms, not just employment relations, but enduring customer relations, dependence on the firm as a kind of a natural monopoly in a particular area where one lives, and various other forms of patronage relation that can sort of ethically underwrite the use of public credit in order to spread ownership in those firms by the various people who have those patronage relations with those firms.
Do you mean like a patronage dividend?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What do you mean by that? Actually?
Well, in the co-op, we get a patronage dividend.
Yeah, it is. It's a similar idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in the front here.
So, what about the idea of the social creditors to issue money through paying a large sum of money to every single individual at 21.
So you don't mean Major Douglas, you mean the kind of baby bond idea or the stakeholder society
No,
idea?
Douglas Society.
Oh, okay. I confess,
Maybe-
yeah, somebody else.
Maybe
should jump
Professor
in.
Blasi, do you know anything about that?
I think,
Major Douglas's plan or scheme.
no, I don't know about that, but didn't Andy Lowry just did a book on that idea too, that I think I would recommend.
One of the Canadian provinces adopted the idea, and the history of that province's experiment with the idea is probably somewhat instructive, right? But I don't know the details, I'm afraid.
All right. In the back there?
Yes, a question for Joseph Blasi. Well, I think many would certainly recognize the distributional benefits of democratizing capital ownership. Given, I think, what Lenore was bringing up about how we had only 12 years, according to the UN, to deal with climate change, I'm a bit concerned about the potential of democratizing capital on its already extractive terms, and I think a good example of that is Volkswagen, who has worker representation on boards, and yet happened to conduct one of the largest frauds that dealt a major blow to carbon emissions across the world. And I'm just curious if there's any way to reconcile that concern with your program.
Can I
Well-
ask a follow-up on that?
Sure, if you can add on real quick.
Could you speak more generally about how effective representation of these other stakeholders in Germany, for example, has been in practice rather than theory?
Yeah.
So let's maybe kick it to Lenore first, and then Blasi, you can answer.
Okay, so I think that in terms of representation, I think your point about, I think that ownership is central and also not enough, and that's why I think that the idea that corporate purpose needs to be reframed to have a materially positive impact on society is part of addressing the catastrophe that we're in. I don't think that's easy. I think as a matter of law, how you would actually determine when a corporation meets that, that's a real tough one. But I think that you can obviously tell right now that they're not meeting it. So let's not pretend we're starting from some place of neutrality. We're starting from a place where there's been tremendous, over the last 100 years, externalities of corporate behavior that have created the climate crisis that we're in, coupled with governments not responding appropriately to do anything about it. So I'll leave more of that, I think, to you, since you asked the question as well. I think that in terms of the actual practice, Volkswagen is a great example of how it can go wrong. I think stakeholder governance, in some ways, part of why it's both extremely radical for us in the US and not radical at all is that it just leaves in place the business judgment rule. It leaves in place so many attributes of corporate decision-making that wouldn't necessarily solve the broader problems that corporations are creating, not only for the society, but even internally. So I don't see it as some kind of panacea such that there wouldn't be challenges anymore. I think that it's simply a different type of structural solution that would at least give us some kind of semblance of rebalancing power among different stakeholders in the firm. Not in any way a complete set of solutions that, I would propose.
So I would answer Professor Marglin's question by saying that scholars of German codetermination recognize that it's been weakening a bit. This does connect to your question, because in the case of Volkswagen, yes, codetermination mandated worker representatives on the board, but the overall corporate governance system of Germany is so insider baseball, and so supporting the managers and such, and so unable to let independent, objective stakeholders have places on the board, that you can't just blame the codetermination. Don't just blame the workers for screwing up Volkswagen. The other thing is if, say in the United States, you had proxy access, where 3, 5, 10% groups of shareholders could simply put a nominee on our current Stalinist board election slates, and those worker board members or worker board member representatives were backed up by actual equity. The prudent thing for equity holders is to make sure that there aren't big risk shocks that will hit the stock like it did with Volkswagen and destroy the company. And so I contrast that with the insider baseball, little mafia, kind of German kind of closed-end boards, you know, weak stock market and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't really think Germany had the kind of stakeholder activism that Lenore is trying to, you know, start this important discussion about.
I think, unfortunately, we only have time for like one more question, but in the back there.
My question is about kind of competitive marketplaces for bundles and regs, or kind of orders generally. We have some, as you mentioned, kind of big paradigm shifts. So Blasi and Palladino about how we want to shift corporate purpose, how we want to change who owns shares. But when it comes to these different jurisdictions and the kind of resilience of the corporate form to serve its own purposes, how do we even guarantee that we'll be able to keep businesses from just moving onto other places, or structuring it in such a way that the weight of their resources are actually listed in like the Netherlands or Luxembourg? How do we do orders?
Certainly within the, I mean, it's something really quick, because I was one of the co-drafters of Senator Warren's ACA, that kind of will capitalism. The key point there, of course, is that what triggers the worker representation requirement on the board is that the firm reaches a certain size, at which point it's required to seek a national charter rather than a state charter. So there would be no escaping, right, the regime by moving from one state to another. You'd have to move to another country. If there was a threat to move to another country, I think the best answer is FDR's answer to the bankers who threatened to leave during the New Deal. He said, you know, well, I shall miss them, but I won't miss them too much, because I'm quite sure they'll be back within 6 months. It's the world's largest market still, and even if China surpasses us as the world's largest market, we'll be the world's second largest market. I don't think most of our firms actually want to go elsewhere. I doubt that they actually want to be regulated by China. So I think that's a bluff when they threaten to sort of take their business elsewhere. If they want to go elsewhere, bye-bye, don't let the door hit you on the way out. They'll be back, as FDR suggested, and he turned out to be right about that, by the way.
Did anyone want to add to that? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming.